Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and the founders of Gestalt psychology, those architects of perception who saw the mind as a weaver of wholes. Together and apart, they approach the mystery of how human consciousness organizes meaning from chaos, one through the language of symbol and archetype, the other through the structures of perception itself. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these minds approached the question of wholeness. Jung, seeing patterns in the unconscious woven from timeless myth and ancestral memory. The Gestalt founders discovering patterns in immediate perception, where the eye and mind create meaning that transcends the sum of parts. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and the Gestalt founders, as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, ideas take form like mist gathering over still water. Some thinkers chase the depths beneath the surface, diving into darkness to retrieve what lies hidden. Others stand at the shore, watching how light plays across the water, how the eye organizes reflection and ripple into meaningful patterns. Carl Jung was a diver into depths. Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Köhler, and Kurt Kafka were watchers of surfaces, though to call them merely observers would miss their profound insight, that the surface itself contains mysteries, that the way we perceive reveals fundamental truths about consciousness, that wholeness exists not just in hidden symbols but in the immediate act of seeing itself. The story of how these two schools of thought emerged requires us to travel back to the early years of the 20th century, when psychology was still finding its language, still deciding whether to be a science of measurement or a study of meaning, still wrestling with whether the human mind could be understood through its parts or only through its patterns. Europe then was a continent of ferment, where old certainties were crumbling and new ways of seeing were struggling to be born. In Vienna, Sigmund Freud was mapping the unconscious. In Zurich, Jung was beginning to chart territories Freud had not imagined. And in Germany, three thinkers were about to revolutionize how psychology understood the act of perception itself. Carl Jung, in the first decade of the 1900s, was still finding his way through the landscape Freud had opened. Born in 1875 in Keswil, Switzerland, Jung had grown up in a world of religious questioning and inner vision. His father was a pastor whose faith seemed hollow, whose prayers echoed in empty spaces. His mother was two people, it seemed, to young Carl, a simple countrywoman by day, an oracle of mysterious wisdom by night. Between them, Jung learned early that the mind contains multiplicities, that consciousness is not singular but plural, that beneath the surface of everyday awareness lie other ways of knowing. By 1900, when Jung was 25, he had begun his work at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital under Eugen Bleuler. Here, among patients diagnosed with dementia praecox, what would later be called schizophrenia. Jung encountered minds that seemed shattered, yet in their fragments he sensed patterns. He developed his word association test, measuring the pauses and disturbances when certain words were spoken, mapping what he would come to call complexes. These were not random disturbances, but organized patterns of emotional energy, little personalities within the personality, autonomous yet part of the whole. In 1906, Jung published his findings on the psychology of dementia praecox and sent a copy to Sigmund Freud in Vienna. The correspondence that followed would shape both their lives. When they finally met in 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight, two explorers comparing maps of territories only they seemed to see. For Jung, Freud was the father he had wished for, the guide who could help him understand the forces moving beneath consciousness. For Freud, Jung was the crown prince, the Gentile who could carry psychoanalysis beyond its Jewish Viennese origins. But even in those early years of collaboration, differences stirred beneath the surface. Freud saw the unconscious as primarily personal, a repository of repressed desires and traumatic memories, with sexuality at its core. Jung was drawn to something broader, deeper. In his work with patients, he noticed that their delusions and visions often contained imagery that echoed ancient myths, that patients who had never studied comparative religion would produce symbols that appeared in Egyptian hieroglyphs or Gnostic texts or medieval alchemy. How could this be if the unconscious was only personal? There must be deeper layers, Jung began to think, layers that transcended individual experience, patterns inherited not through teaching, but through the structure of the human mind itself. By 1912, the break with Freud was inevitable. Jung published Symbols of Transformation, a work that reinterpreted the libido not as merely sexual energy but as a broader life force. And that saw the mother not just as an object of infantile desire, but as an archetypal image carrying meanings that transcended any individual mother. Freud could not accept this. The friendship ended, and Jung entered what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of profound psychological crisis from 1913 to 1919, when he deliberately opened himself to the images and visions rising from within, recording them in what would become the Red Book. This was Jung's crucible. Descending into his own depths, he encountered not chaos, but pattern. He met figures, an old wise man he called Philemon, a feminine guide he called Anima, who seemed to have their own autonomy, who taught him things he did not consciously know. He experienced visions of vast collective catastrophe that seemed to prefigure the coming world war. He emerged from this period convinced that the unconscious was not merely a basement of forgotten memories, but a living matrix of universal patterns, what he would call archetypes, organizing principles that shaped how humans across all cultures understood birth and death, hero and trickster, mother and father, shadow and light. By the 1920s, Jung had begun to develop his mature psychology. He distinguished between the personal unconscious, containing an individual's repressed or forgotten experiences, and the collective unconscious, containing the inherited patterns of human experience. He developed the concept of psychological types, exploring how different orientations of consciousness, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, and different attitudes, extroversion and introversion, shaped how individuals engaged with the world. He explored the process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness through integration of the shadow, encounter with the anima or animus, an eventual relationship with the self that archetype of totality that transcends yet includes the ego. Throughout all this work, Jung's method remained focused on meaning. He approached dreams, visions, symptoms, and synchronicities as communications from the unconscious, laden with symbolic significance. A dream image was never merely what it appeared to be, but always pointed towards something more, some archetypal pattern seeking expression, some aspect of the personality seeking integration. Jung amplified dream images by exploring their cultural parallels, finding in myths and fairy tales and religious texts the same symbolic language his patients' unconscious minds were speaking. This was Jung's world. Deep, symbolic, concerned with the vertical dimension of consciousness, diving down through personal history into collective memory, seeking the timeless patterns that give human experience its shape and meaning. It was a psychology of stories, of myths, of the narrative arc through which the soul journeys toward wholeness. Now we must turn to a different world, a different set of questions, asked by different men in response to different problems. Max Wertheimer was born in Prague in 1880, 5 years after Jung, into a world of Austro-Hungarian intellectual ferment. Prague, then, was a city of multiple languages, multiple cultures, Czech and German and Jewish traditions, interweaving. Wertheimer studied philosophy and psychology in Prague, then Berlin, then Würzburg, where he received his doctorate in 1904, the same year Jung was beginning his word association experiments. Wertheimer's early interests ranged widely: music, philosophy, the psychology of testimony and truth-telling. But the insight that would found Gestalt psychology came to him in 1910 during a train journey. Looking out the window, he noticed something about apparent motion, the way the mind perceives movement when in fact there are only static images presented in rapid succession. This was the phenomenon behind motion pictures, behind the flickering illusion that makes still photographs appear to move. Wertheimer interrupted his journey in Frankfurt and bought a toy stroboscope. He spent the summer conducting experiments on apparent motion at the Frankfurt Academy's Psychological Institute. There he met 2 younger psychologists, Wolfgang Köhler and Kurt Kafka, who became both his research assistants and his collaborators in developing what would become Gestalt psychology. Wolfgang Köhler was born in 1887 in Revel, Estonia, then part of the Russian Empire. His family was German, and he studied in Tübingen and Bonn and Berlin, receiving his doctorate in 1909 under Carl Stumpf, one of the leading psychologists of the era. Köhler was trained in physics before turning to psychology, and he brought to the new discipline a physicist's appreciation for fields and forces, for the way systems organize themselves according to inherent principles. Kurt Kafka was born in 1886 in Berlin. Like Köhler, he studied under Stumpf, receiving his doctorate in 1908. He was drawn to questions of perception and development, to understanding how consciousness organizes experience from infancy onward. When these 3 met in Frankfurt in 1910, something crystallized. Wertheimer's insight into apparent motion revealed something fundamental. The mind does not simply receive sensations and add them up. Instead, consciousness actively organizes perceptual elements into meaningful wholes, and these wholes have properties that cannot be predicted from the parts alone. The experience of apparent motion, the perception of movement where there is none, could not be explained by analyzing the individual still images. The movement emerged from their relationship, from the pattern, from what Wertheimer would call the Gestalt. Gestalt is a German word with no perfect English equivalent. It means shape, form, pattern, configuration, the whole that is more than and different from the sum of its parts. For Wertheimer, Köhler, and Kafka, this concept became the foundation of a revolution in how psychology understood mind. Their revolution began modestly, with careful experiments on perception. Wertheimer published his findings on apparent motion in 1912, the same year Jung broke with Freud in a paper that is generally considered the founding document of Gestalt psychology. In it, he argued that the phi phenomenon, as he called apparent motion, could not be explained by existing psychological theories that treated perception as a process of building up complex experiences from simple sensations. Instead, the experience of motion was primary, immediate, a whole that organized itself according to principles inherent in the perceptual system. Over the following years, the Gestalt psychologists developed a series of principles describing how perception organizes to itself. They showed that we perceive figure against ground, that some elements emerge as focal and meaningful, while others recede into background. They demonstrated proximity, that elements near each other tend to be grouped together. They explored similarity, that elements resembling each other cohere into patterns. They examined closure, the tendency to complete incomplete forms, to see a circle even when the line is broken, to fill gaps with expected pattern. These principles might seem simple, obvious even, but they represented a fundamental challenge to the dominant psychology of the time. In Germany, Wilhelm Wundt's structuralism had attempted to break consciousness down into elementary sensations, to analyze mind into its basic components. In America, behaviorism was reducing psychology to the study of stimulus and response, eliminating consciousness altogether from the scientific equation. Against both these reductionist approaches, Gestalt psychology insisted that wholes must be understood on their own terms, that analysis into parts destroys the very phenomena psychology should study, that the patterns of perception reveal something essential about how consciousness works. Wolfgang Köhler developed this insight most fully in his years on Tenerife in the Canary Islands, where he spent World War I studying chimpanzee cognition. Separated from his colleagues by the war, Köhler conducted careful observations of how chimpanzees solve problems. What he discovered challenged the behaviorist assumption that learning happens gradually through trial and error and reinforcement. Instead, Köhler's chimpanzees showed what he called insight, sudden perceptual restructuring, where a problem that had seemed insoluble suddenly revealed its solution. His most famous example involved a chimpanzee named Sultan, presented with a banana hanging too high to reach and several boxes scattered around the room. Sultan at first tried various ineffective approaches, jumping, reaching, using a single box as a platform. Then, after a pause, he suddenly stacked the boxes, climbed them, and retrieved the banana. Köhler argued that this was not random trial and error, but a moment of insight, when Sultan suddenly perceived the boxes not as separate objects, but as potential components of a solution. When the whole problem reorganized itself in his perception. Köhler published these findings in 1917 in The Mentality of Apes, a work that would influence generations of psychologists. Its implications went far beyond animal behavior. If chimpanzees could have insight, if learning involved sudden perceptual restructuring rather than gradual association, then consciousness was more creative, more holistic, more capable of grasping patterns than behaviorism allowed. Kurt Kafka, meanwhile, was developing the applications of Gestalt psychology to development and learning. In 1921, he published an article in an American journal introducing Gestalt psychology to English-speaking audiences, though his claim that we see things as wholes was misunderstood by some as meaning merely that perception is holistic. In 1924, he published The Growth of the Mind, exploring how children's perception develops, how they learn to organize experience into meaningful patterns. Kafka would later emigrate to America, teaching at Cornell and then settling at Smith College in 1927. There he became one of the primary ambassadors of Gestalt psychology to the American context, always working to show that the Gestalt approach offered a middle way between the introspective mentalism of older psychology and the reductive behaviorism of Watson and Skinner. Max Wertheimer, though he published less prolifically than his colleagues, remained the philosophical heart of the movement. His concerns went beyond technical questions of perception to fundamental issues of truth, value, and productive thinking. In 1920, he published On Truth, exploring how genuine insight differs from rote learning or superficial cleverness. For Wertheimer, truth was not a matter of abstract logic, but of seeing the inner requirements of a situation, grasping what a problem truly needed, perceiving structural relationships rather than arbitrary associations. In the 1920s and early 30s, Gestalt psychology flourished in Germany, particularly in Berlin, where Wertheimer, Kohler, and Kafka all taught at various times. They gathered around them students who would carry forward the approach: Kurt Lewin with his field theory of motivation and social psychology, Karl Duncker with his work on problem solving, Wolfgang Metzger with his phenomenological explorations of perception. The Psychological Institute at Berlin became a center of innovative research into how consciousness organizes meaning. But as the 30s progressed, the shadow of Nazism fell across German intellectual life. All three founders of Gestalt psychology, along with many of their students, were Jewish or politically opposed to the Nazi regime or both. Max Wertheimer immigrated to America in 1933, taking a position at the New School for Social Research in New York, that haven for exiled European intellectuals. Wolfgang Kohler, though not Jewish, openly opposed the Nazi regime, delivering a last newspaper article criticizing their policies in 1934 before he too felt compelled to leave. Emigrating in 1935 and taking a position at Swarthmore College, Kurt Kafka was already in America at Smith College. In exile, separated from their institutional base, the Gestalt psychologists continued their work, but in a different context. America in the 30s and 40s was dominated by behaviorism. The careful phenomenological studies of perception that had seemed so revolutionary in Berlin were harder to pursue in a culture that valued prediction and control over understanding and meaning. Yet they persisted. Kohler published The Place of Value in a World of Facts in 1938, arguing that values and meanings are not subjective additions to an objective world, but are given in the very structure of perception, that we perceive a demand character in situations, and ought to be done. Wertheimer worked on his book on productive thinking, exploring how genuine understanding differs from mechanical application of rules, though it would not be published until 1945, after his death in 1943. Now, as you rest, consider the landscape we have traversed. By the 1920s, when Jung's analytical psychology was taking mature form and the Gestalt psychologists were establishing their approach, two very different ways of understanding wholeness had emerged. Jung, working primarily with dreams, symptoms, and the narratives of individual lives, had discovered or articulated archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious, timeless structures of meaning inherited through the deep history of the species. Wertheimer, Kohler, and Kafka, working primarily with perception, problem-solving, and the immediate structures of experience, had discovered or articulated laws of organization inherent in consciousness itself, patterns through which mind creates coherent wholes from fragmentary inputs. Did these two schools know each other? Did Jung read Wertheimer's papers on apparent motion or Kohler's studies of insight? Did the Gestalt founders encounter Jung's theories of archetypes and the collective unconscious? The historical record shows relatively little direct engagement, yet they moved in overlapping circles. Both were part of the ferment of German-language psychology in the first third of the 20th century. Both participated in the same conferences, published in overlapping journals, responded to the same intellectual problems. Jung spent time in Germany, had German colleagues and correspondents, was deeply engaged with German philosophy and psychology. The Gestalt founders knew of psychoanalysis, though they were skeptical of its interpretation-heavy methods and its focus on unconscious drives. They sought a psychology that stayed closer to immediate experience, that described what was given in perception before theory imposed meanings. There is a telling absence in their mutual engagement. Jung rarely cited Gestalt psychology in his major works. The Gestalt founders rarely engaged with Jung's archetypal theories. Yet this absence is itself meaningful. They were so close in some ways, both seeking wholeness, both opposing reductionism, both trying to understand how mind organizes meaning from chaos, yet so far apart in others. They were like two rivers flowing in the same valley but on opposite sides, parallel yet separate, drawn by the same gravity toward the same sea but never quite meeting. The context that shaped both their approaches was the crisis of meaning in early 20th century Europe. The old certainties were collapsing. Religious authority had been undermined by scientific materialism. Political stability was shattered by World War I. The Enlightenment dream of pure reason had produced mechanized slaughter. Into this crisis, both Jung's analytical psychology and Gestalt psychology offered responses, though radically different ones. Jung's response was to dive deep, to find in the collective unconscious a ground of meaning that transcended historical catastrophe. If the conscious mind and its cultural forms had failed, perhaps the unconscious still held wisdom. The archetypes, those primordial patterns of human experience, could reconnect modern individuals to the deep sources of meaning, to the myths and symbols through which humans had always made sense of existence. The Gestalt founders' response was to rebuild from immediate experience, to show that meaning was not imposed from without or from below, but emerged in the very act of perception itself. Against the fragmentation of modernity, they demonstrated that consciousness inherently seeks wholeness, that the mind naturally organizes chaos into pattern, that insight and understanding are not rare gifts, but fundamental capacities of perception and thought. Both were responses to the same wound, the same sense that something essential had been lost or fragmented. But where Jung sought healing through descent and recovery of ancient symbols, the Gestalt founders sought healing through precise attention to how consciousness structures meaning in the present moment. Where Jung looked backward to timeless patterns, they looked to the immediate and ongoing process of organizing experience. As World War I raged, as empires collapsed, as the old world burned, Jung was descending into his own unconscious, dialoguing with Philemon in his visions, painting and writing in what would become the Red Book, discovering the archetypes. Meanwhile, Kohler was on Tenerife, patiently watching Sultan and the other chimpanzees solve problems, discovering insight as a sudden perceptual restructuring. The contrast is almost too perfect. Jung, in interior darkness, finding eternal symbols. Kohler in clear daylight, watching minds reorganize perception. Yet both were seeking the same thing. How does consciousness create meaning? How does the mind find or make coherence? What patterns organize the chaos of experience into something intelligible? These questions would lead them to radically different answers. But before we explore those differences, take a breath. Let your body settle deeper into rest. Feel how your own mind, even now, is organizing the sounds of these words into meanings, finding patterns in the flow of language, creating wholes from parts. This is what both Jung and the Gestalt psychologists were trying to understand, this miracle of meaning-making that you perform effortlessly as you drift toward sleep. In the territory between their two approaches lies a landscape of profound questions about human consciousness, about what it means to understand and be understood, about how mind and world connect. As we move deeper into their dialogue, we will explore that territory together, gently, letting the comparisons reveal themselves like stars emerging in the evening sky. Now we turn to the heart of the comparison, to the place where their ideas meet and diverge, where two conceptions of wholeness reveal both their kinship and their fundamental differences. Imagine a clearing in a forest where two paths converge briefly before continuing in different directions. In this clearing, Jung and the Gestalt founders might meet, might recognize in each other a shared opposition to reductionism, a shared commitment to understanding wholes. But as they talk, the differences would emerge, subtle at first, then fundamental. Both Jung and Gestalt psychology began with a rejection of the dominant psychology of their time. Jung's early work in word association had shown him that the psyche was not simply a collection of conscious thoughts, but contained organized patterns, complexes that seemed to have autonomy, that could take over consciousness, that operated according to their own logic. This led him to question Wundt's structuralism and even Freud's psychoanalysis, both of which, in different ways, tried to reduce the psyche to simpler elements and processes. The Gestalt founders similarly rejected Wundt's structuralism, which attempted to analyze consciousness into elementary sensations. They demonstrated through careful experiments that perception does not build up from simple sensations to complex wholes, but begins with wholes that are then analyzed into parts. When you see a face, you do not first perceive colored patches that you then assemble into features and finally recognize as a face. Instead, you immediately perceive the face as a coherent whole. Only with effort can you analyze it into component features. This reversal was revolutionary. It meant that wholeness was primary, not derivative. It meant that the analytic method beloved by traditional science, breaking things down into simpler components, was inadequate for psychology, because the very act of analysis destroyed what needed to be understood. Here, Jung and the Gestalt founders stood together, allies against the prevailing winds of reductionism. Both insisted that wholes must be understood as wholes. Jung's archetypes could not be reduced to simpler elements without losing their essential character. The hero is not merely a collection of traits, but a pattern of meaning that transcends any particular representation. Similarly, the Gestalt psychologists showed that a melody cannot be understood by analyzing individual notes, because the melody is precisely the relationship among the notes, the pattern that can be transposed to different keys while remaining recognizably the same. But this shared holism concealed a profound difference in what they meant by wholeness, in what kind of patterns they were studying, in how they understood the organizing principle of consciousness. For the Gestalt founders, wholeness was a matter of perceptual and cognitive organization. It was about how the visual system organizes light and dark into figure and ground, how the auditory system organizes sound into melody and rhythm, how thought organizes a problem into a solution. These were formal patterns, structures of organization that could be described in terms of principles like proximity, similarity, closure, good continuation. For Jung, wholeness was also formal, in a sense. Archetypes are patterns, but they were patterns laden with meaning, with symbolic significance, with emotional and spiritual resonance. The mother archetype organizes experience not merely as a formal pattern, but as a deeply meaningful presence, connecting the individual to experiences of nurturance, containment, origin, and return. It appears in dreams, not as an abstract principle, but as an image, the mother, the ocean, the cave, the vessel that carries emotional weight and existential significance. Consider a simple example. A child sees a circle. From the Gestalt perspective, several things are happening. The child's perceptual system is using the principle of closure to complete any small gaps in the line, organizing the visual input into a coherent whole. The circle emerges as figure against ground. If there are multiple circles of similar size, they are grouped together by similarity. If they are near each other, proximity binds them into a pattern. All of this happens immediately, pre-reflectively, as part of the automatic organization of perception. From Jung's perspective, something else might also be happening, or might happen later when the child is older and the symbolic dimension of consciousness has developed. The circle is not merely a perceptual form, but a mandala, a symbol of wholeness, completion, the self. It appears across cultures in sacred art, in sand paintings, in rose windows, in the zodiac, in the circular dances of ritual. When it appears in a dream, Jung would not see it merely as a shape, but as a symbol of psychic totality, perhaps indicating the dreamer is moving toward greater integration, perhaps compensating for one-sidedness in conscious attitude. Both are studying wholeness, but wholeness of different kinds. The Gestalt psychologists are studying how consciousness organizes perceptual and cognitive patterns. Jung is studying how the psyche organizes symbolic meanings. The Gestalt approach stays at the level of form, structure, organization. Jung's approach goes to the level of content, meaning, significance. This difference becomes clearer when we consider how each approach the question of insight. For the Gestalt psychologists, insight was a perceptual phenomenon, a sudden restructuring of how the elements of a problem are organized. Kohler's Sultan, staring at the boxes and the unreachable banana, experiences insight when he suddenly sees the boxes not as separate obstacles, but as components of a solution. When the problem space reorganizes itself and the path to the goal becomes visible. Wertheimer explored this further in his work on productive thinking. He contrasted rote application of learned rules, what he called blind thinking, with genuine understanding that grasps the inner structure of a problem. In blind thinking, you apply a formula without understanding why it works, mechanically following steps. In productive thinking, you see the functional relationships within the problem, understand what needs to happen and why, reorganize the elements according to their structural requirements. For example, finding the area of a parallelogram. A student taught blindly might memorize the formula base times height without understanding. A student with insight sees that the parallelogram can be reorganized. Cut a triangle from one end and move it to the other to form a rectangle, and suddenly understands why base times height gives the area. The formula is no longer arbitrary, but emerges from the structure of the situation itself. This is insight as perceptual and cognitive restructuring. The elements remain the same, but their organization changes, and this change in organization reveals the solution. It is sudden aha rather than gradual. It involves seeing the whole situation in a new way, and it brings a sense of rightness, of necessity, of this has to be so that differs from the arbitrary connection of trial and error learning. Jung also spoke of insight, but for him it meant something different. Insight, in analytical psychology, is the moment when a symbol reveals its meaning, when unconscious content becomes conscious, when what was hidden emerges into awareness. A patient dreams of descending a dark stairway into an underground chamber where a wise old man sits by a fire. Through the process of analysis, exploring the patient's associations, amplifying the symbols through cultural parallels, relating the dream to the patient's life situation, insight emerges. The old man is a manifestation of the archetype of the wise old man, representing the patient's own deeper wisdom, which has been inaccessible because the patient's conscious attitude has been too one-sided, too rational, cutting off intuition and inner guidance. This insight is not primarily a perceptual restructuring. The elements of the dream do not reorganize themselves into a new pattern that solves a puzzle. Rather, the symbolic meaning of the dream becomes apparent, and this meaning relates to the patient's psychological development. The insight is that consciousness needs to attend to unconscious wisdom, that the patient needs to integrate what the old man represents. Or, consider one of Jung's own insights during his confrontation with the unconscious. He had a vision of a beautiful garden with a mole heaping up earth in the center, disturbing the perfection. In reflecting on this vision, insight came. The mole represented his work, his digging in the unconscious, which was disrupting the aesthetic surface of life, but was necessary, was following its own instinct, was doing what it had to do. This insight did not solve a perceptual problem, but provided meaning, helped Jung accept and value his difficult inner work. Both kinds of insight bring illumination, but different kinds, Gestalt insight, illuminates how to solve a problem by reorganizing perception of its elements. Jungian insight illuminates the meaning of a symbol by connecting it to archetypal patterns in personal development. One is cognitive, the other is existential. One is about seeing how, the other is about seeing what it means. This difference reflects a deeper divergence in what each approach took as its subject matter. The Gestalt psychologists focused on the immediate given of perception and thought. They practiced a kind of phenomenology, describing experience as it presents itself before interpretation. When Wertheimer looked at apparent motion, he described what was actually perceived movement, not what was really there, static images. The perception was the reality to be explained, not an illusion to be explained away. This phenomenological stance meant staying close to immediate experience, bracketing questions of deeper meaning, ultimate significance, symbolic interpretation. A triangle is perceived as a triangle. That is what needs to be understood. why we perceive three lines in a certain configuration as a unified shape, what principles of organization govern this perception, how the mind creates gestalt from fragmentary input. These are the questions. Jung's approach started not with immediate perception, but with symbolic expression, dreams, visions, myths, symptoms, art. These were treated not as simple givens to be described, but as manifestations of deeper patterns, as communications from the unconscious needing interpretation. A dream image was never only what it appeared to be. It was symbolic, pointing beyond itself to archetypal meanings. This meant Jung was always interpreting, always looking through the surface to the depths, always amplifying the immediate content by connecting it to cultural parallels and universal patterns. Where the Gestalt psychologists practiced description of the given, Jung practiced hermeneutics of the hidden. Where they stayed at the level of appearance, he probed for underlying significance. Imagine them discussing a dream. A patient dreams of walking through a forest and coming upon a clearing where four paths meet in a cross pattern. At the center stands a tree. The Gestalt approach would attend to the perceptual and organizational features of the dream. Experience. How did the dreamer perceive the space? What was figure? What was ground? How were the elements organized? The four paths create a symmetrical pattern, balanced, with the tree as the central focus. The clearing emerges as figure against the ground of the surrounding forest. There is a quality of order, of intentional arrangement, but the Gestalt psychologists would be cautious about going further, about imposing symbolic interpretations. They would want to understand how the dreamer experienced the scene, what the perceptual and emotional qualities were, without adding layers of meaning not present in the immediate experience. Jung, encountering the same dream, would see it as manifestly symbolic. The forest is the unconscious, mysterious, uncharted. The clearing is a sacred space, a temenos where transformation can occur. The four paths represent the four functions of consciousness, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition meeting at a center. The tree is the axis, mundi, the world tree, connecting earth and heaven, unconscious and conscious, matter and spirit. The whole dream presents a mandala-like structure, suggesting the dream is pointing toward the self, toward the archetype of wholeness. Where the Gestalt approach would describe the experience, Jung's approach unfolds layers of meaning, connecting the personal dream to universal patterns. One stays with the phenomenal surface, the other reads it as text laden with significance. Which approach is right? The question itself may be misguided. They are approaching different aspects of the same phenomenon. The dream is both a perceptual experience with certain organizational features and a symbolic communication with layers of meaning. To focus only on the perceptual structure is to miss the meaning. To focus only on the symbolic meaning is to miss how consciousness organizes the experience. Yet the Gestalt founders would likely argue that Jung's interpretive method violates the integrity of the phenomenon. By imposing cultural parallels and archetypal meanings, isn't he adding content that may not be present in the dreamer's actual experience? Isn't he reading his own knowledge of mythology and symbolism into the dream rather than letting the dream speak for itself? Jung would respond that symbols are not arbitrary creations but expressions of archetypal patterns. The dreamer may not consciously know about the axis mundi, but the unconscious knows, because the archetype is inherent in the collective psyche. The The symbols appear in the dream precisely because they are archetypal, because they carry meanings that transcend the personal. To refuse to interpret is to leave the dreamer stranded at the surface, unable to access the deeper wisdom the unconscious is offering. This tension between description and interpretation, between staying with the given and probing for hidden meaning, runs through all their differences. The Gestalt founders wanted psychology to be a rigorous science based on careful observation and experimentation. They developed precise methods for studying perception, created standardized problems for investigating insight, measured and quantified wherever possible. Their principles of perceptual organization, proximity, similarity, closure could be tested experimentally, demonstrated reliably across subjects. Jung's method was much less standardized. Each dream, each symbol, each individual required a unique approach. The meaning of a symbol depended on the dreamer's personal associations, their life situation, their stage of psychological development. While archetypes were universal patterns, their manifestations were infinitely various. This made Jung's psychology rich, but also resistant to experimental verification. How could you prove that a dream image represented the anima? You could show it fit the pattern, could demonstrate parallels in mythology, could trace its effects in the dreamer's life, but you couldn't measure or quantify the symbolic meaning in the way Gestalt psychologists could measure perceptual thresholds or problem-solving times. This difference in method reflected different underlying commitments. The Gestalt psychologists were committed to keeping psychology scientific in the sense of being based on observable phenomena, describable in terms of lawful principles, replicable across subjects. They were phenomenologists, but also experimentalists. They wanted to describe consciousness as it is given, but to do so in ways that could be verified intersubjectively. Jung was willing to venture into territories where science, at least as traditionally conceived, could not follow. The unconscious could not be directly observed, only inferred from its manifestations. Symbolic meanings could not be measured, only interpreted through an art that required cultural knowledge, psychological sensitivity, and intuitive understanding. Jung's psychology was as much hermeneutic art as empirical science. Yet both were trying to be faithful to their subject matter. The Gestalt founders believed that consciousness organizes itself according to inherent principles, and these principles could be discovered through careful observation. Jung believed that the psyche expresses itself in symbols, and these symbols could be understood through interpretation. Each method suited what it was trying to understand. Consider their different approaches to what consciousness does. For Gestalt psychology, consciousness organizes sensory input into meaningful patterns according to inherent principles. Perception is active, not passive. The mind does not simply record what is there, but structures, experience, creating figure and ground, grouping elements, completing incomplete forms, seeking good Gestalt, that is, seeking the most simple, regular, symmetric organization possible given the input. These principles operate automatically, below the level of conscious intention. You do not decide to see figure and ground. It happens. You do not choose to group similar elements together. Your perceptual system does it for you. These are the inherent dynamics of consciousness as a self-organizing system. Kohler, with his background in physics, often used the analogy of physical fields. Just as soap bubbles automatically assume a spherical shape because surface tension minimizes surface area, just as electrical fields organize themselves according to the principle of least action, So consciousness organizes itself according to principles that minimize complexity and maximize coherence. The mind seeks equilibrium, balance, good form. This is a vision of consciousness as self-organizing pattern, following formal principles that can be described mathematically or geometrically. It is elegant, precise, and deeply important. It shows that mind is not chaotic, but ordered, that the order is not imposed from outside, but emerges from the nature of consciousness itself. Jung's vision of consciousness is different, but perhaps complementary. For Jung, consciousness is always in dialogue with the unconscious. The ego, that center of conscious identity, is surrounded by depths it does not control and barely knows. The unconscious is not merely a repository of forgotten memories, but a living matrix of archetypal patterns, capable of producing symbols, guiding development, compensating one-sidedness, pointing toward wholeness. Consciousness, in Jung's view, is always incomplete, always partial, always in need of what the unconscious can provide. The ego tends toward one-sidedness, developing certain functions and attitudes while neglecting others. A person might over-identify with thinking and neglect feeling, might be too extroverted and lose connection to inner life. The unconscious compensates, producing dreams and symptoms that challenge the conscious attitude, pushing toward balance and integration. This is also a vision of self-organization, but of a different kind, where Gestalt psychology describes the inherent principles of perceptual and cognitive organization. Jung describes the teleological movement of the psyche toward wholeness. Where Gestalt focuses on formal patterns of organization, Jung focuses on meaningful patterns of development. Teleology, the idea that psychological processes are purposive, oriented toward goals, was central to Jung, but absent from Gestalt psychology. The Gestalt founders explained organization in terms of inherent principles, not purposes. Perception seeks good Gestalt not because it is aiming at something, but because that is how perceptual systems work. Just as water flows downhill not to reach the bottom, but because gravity operates. Jung, however, saw purpose everywhere in the psyche. The self, that archetype of wholeness, acts like a guiding principle, drawing the personality toward integration. Dreams compensate the conscious attitude, offering what consciousness lacks. Symbols emerge that point toward the next stage of development. The process of individuation is inherently meaningful, a journey toward becoming who you truly are. This difference might seem subtle, but it is crucial. For Gestalt psychology, organization is mechanical in the sense of following natural laws, even if those laws produce meaningful patterns. For Jung, organization is meaningful in itself, serving the psyche's inherent tendency toward wholeness and self-realization. Perhaps we can see both as true at different levels. Consciousness organizes perception according to formal principles. This is the Gestalt insight. But consciousness also organizes meaning according to archetypal patterns. This is Jung's insight. The first is about cognitive structure, the second about existential significance. Yet even here, a tension remains. The Gestalt founders would worry that invoking purpose and meaning is a return to pre-scientific thinking, to vitalism and metaphysics. They wanted psychology to be naturalistic, explaining mental phenomena in terms of processes that could be studied scientifically without invoking unmeasurable forces or purposes. Jung would respond that purpose and meaning are phenomenologically real, that humans experience their lives as meaningful, that to exclude this is to miss something essential about psychic life. Science that cannot account for meaning, that reduces the rich symbolic life of the psyche to mechanical processes, is science that has missed its proper subject matter. This was perhaps the deepest divide between them. Not whether wholes are real or whether organization matters, but whether meaning is inherent in psychological processes or is something added by human interpretation. The Gestalt founders leaned toward the first position. Meaning emerges from organization, but is not itself a causal force. Jung insisted on the second. Meaning is itself real, active, shaping psychological development. Let us explore how their different approaches would handle a concrete example. Consider the experience of seeing a face in the clouds. For the Gestalt psychologists, this is an instance of pattern recognition. The mind's tendency to organize visual input into meaningful forms leads it to perceive face-like patterns, even in random arrangements of light and dark. The principles of similarity and proximity cause certain features of the cloud formation to cohere into eyes, nose, mouth. The principle of closure fills in missing details. The overall configuration is organized as figure against the ground of the sky. This is an example of pareidolia, seeing patterns where none objectively exist. But from the Gestalt perspective, it reveals something important about perception. The mind actively organizes input, seeking meaningful patterns, even imposing them where the input is ambiguous. This is not a flaw, but a feature, a consequence of how perceptual organization works. Jung would not disagree with this analysis, but would see another dimension. The fact that we see faces, and particularly that across cultures humans tend to see faces rather than, say, geometric patterns or abstract forms, points to an archetypal basis for face recognition. The face is one of the most primordial patterns of human experience, appearing from infancy as the focus of attachment and communication. It becomes an archetypal image, carrying enormous emotional and psychological significance. When we see a face in the clouds, we are not merely organizing visual input, but projecting an archetypal pattern onto ambiguous material. This projection reveals the active, creative nature of the psyche. The unconscious populates the world with its images, sees its patterns in external phenomena. This is not illusion, but revelation of how consciousness and the unconscious interact, how the archetypal dimension shapes perception and experience. Moreover, Jung might explore what kind of face appears. Is it benevolent or threatening? Familiar or strange? Different qualities would reveal different aspects of the unconscious projected onto the clouds. A patient who consistently sees threatening faces and ambiguous stimuli might be projecting shadow material, unacknowledged negative aspects of their own personality, or might be dealing with a negative mother complex that causes them to see danger in the world. Both approaches illuminate something true. The Gestalt analysis explains the perceptual mechanisms through which the face emerges. Jung's analysis explores the symbolic significance and what it reveals about the psyche. But notice how they stay in their respective domains. Gestalt psychology stays at the level of perceptual organization. Jung moves to the level of archetypal projection and symbolic meaning. Can these be integrated? Perhaps. We could say that consciousness inherently seeks pattern, Gestalt, and that the patterns it tends to find reflect archetypal structures, Jung, the mechanisms of perceptual organization described by Gestalt psychology are the formal cause of seeing faces in clouds. The archetypal significance of faces is the meaningful dimension that makes this particular pattern compelling. Yet such integration was not pursued by either side during their lifetimes. they remained largely separate traditions, speaking different languages, addressing different audiences, solving different problems. Another area of comparison is their understanding of insight and problem solving. We have touched on this, but let us go deeper. For the Gestalt psychologist, particularly Wertheimer, productive thinking involves grasping the structural requirements of a situation. A genuine solution is not arbitrary, but emerges from understanding what the problem actually requires. Wertheimer loved to work with mathematical problems because they reveal this so clearly. Consider the problem of finding the sum of the series 1 plus 2 plus 3 all the way up to 100. One could add laboriously, but there is an insight that makes it simple. Arrange the numbers in pairs from opposite ends of the series. 1 plus 100 equals 101. 2 plus 99 equals 101. 3 plus 98 equals 101. There are 50 such pairs, so the answer is 50 times 101, or 5050. This solution emerges from seeing the structure of the series, understanding that it can be reorganized to reveal a pattern. It is elegant, necessary, beautiful. Once you see it, you understand not just the answer, but why it must be the answer. This is productive thinking, grasping the inner necessity of the situation. Wertheimer contrasted this with learning formulas by rote without understanding. A student taught the formula n times n plus 1 divided by 2 for the sum of the first n integers might get correct answers but lacks true understanding. They cannot see why the formula works, cannot derive it from the structure of the problem, cannot adapt if the problem changes slightly. For Wertheimer, education should cultivate productive thinking, teaching students to see structural relationships rather than memorize procedures. This required understanding the gestalt of the problem, seeing it as a whole with internal coherence rather than as a collection of arbitrary rules. Jung also valued insight but understood it differently. For Jung, insight meant seeing through the illusions of the ego to the deeper patterns of the psyche. A person might believe they are acting from rational choice when in fact they are being driven by an unconscious complex. Insight means recognizing this, seeing the complex at work, understanding how it shapes behavior. Or insight might mean recognizing an archetypal pattern in one's life. A man repeats the same relationship difficulties with women, always seeking an idealized beloved who inevitably disappoints. Through analysis, insight emerges. He is possessed by the anima, the archetypal image of the feminine in a man's psyche. He is not related to this image consciously, so he projects it onto women, seeking in them the qualities that actually belong to his own inner feminine nature. Insight means recognizing this pattern, withdrawing the projection, developing a conscious relationship with the anima. These are different kinds of insight, but perhaps they share something. Both involve seeing beyond surface appearances to underlying patterns. Gestalt insight sees the structural pattern that solves a problem. Jungian insight sees the archetypal pattern that shapes behavior. Both involve a kind of reorganization, in one case of problem elements, in the other of self-understanding. Yet there remains a crucial difference. Gestalt insight is cognitive. It illuminates how to think about or solve a problem. Jungian insight is existential. It transforms how one understands oneself and lives. Gestalt insight brings intellectual satisfaction. Jungian insight brings psychological transformation. This connects to their different understandings of what consciousness needs. For the Gestalt psychologists, consciousness needs clear perception, accurate organization of experience, productive thinking that grasps structural relationships. Distortions arise when perceptual organization is poor, when thinking is blind rather than insightful. For Jung, consciousness needs integration with the unconscious, balance among the different functions and attitudes, relationship with the archetypal dimension. Problems arise not from poor perception, but from one-sidedness, repression, inflation, possession by complexes, alienation from the self. These are different diagnoses of the human condition. Gestalt psychology sees the fundamental issue as cognitive, how consciousness organizes experience and solves problems. Jung sees the fundamental issue as depth psychological, the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, the journey toward wholeness. Perhaps both are necessary. Perhaps we need both clear perception and symbolic meaning, both cognitive organization and archetypal integration. A psychology that includes only Gestalt principles might produce clear thinkers who lack self-knowledge. A psychology that includes only Jungian depth might produce self-reflective individuals who cannot think clearly about practical problems. Consider their approaches to psychological development. For the Gestalt psychologists, particularly Kafka, development involves increasingly complex and differentiated organization of experience. An infant's perception is initially less differentiated. Figure and ground are less distinct, patterns less articulated. Development brings greater clarity, more sophisticated perceptual and cognitive organization. Kafka traced how children learn to organize their perceptual and motor space, how they develop concepts through recognizing patterns and similarities, how their thinking becomes more flexible and capable of handling complex relationships. This is development as increasing cognitive sophistication, as the unfolding of consciousness's inherent capacity to organize experience in increasingly complex ways. Jung's understanding of development is very different. For Jung, the first half of life involves building up the ego and establishing oneself in the world, career, relationships, social identity. But this necessarily involves one-sidedness, developing some potentials while neglecting others. The second half of life, ideally, involves individuation, turning inward to integrate what was neglected, encountering the shadow and anima or animus, developing the inferior function, gradually approaching the self. This is development as a journey through archetypal stages, as a process of self-realization that is psychological and spiritual simultaneously. It is not primarily about cognitive sophistication, but about wholeness, about becoming conscious of who one truly is beneath social roles and ego identifications. These accounts of development are incommensurable in some ways. They describe different dimensions of human growth. Yet perhaps an integrated view would acknowledge both. We develop cognitively, becoming more sophisticated in how we organize, experience, and solve problems, Gestalt, and we develop psychologically, becoming more whole through integrating conscious and unconscious, Jung. Let us turn to their different attitudes toward emotion and motivation. For the Gestalt psychologists, these topics were somewhat peripheral to their core concerns. They focused on perception and cognition, the cold cognition of how consciousness organizes sensory input and solves problems. Emotion and motivation were less central to their research program, though Kurt Lewin, associated with the Gestalt school, did develop a field theory of motivation that applied Gestalt principles to understanding goals, barriers, and psychological forces. Jung, in contrast, saw emotion as central. Emotion was the energy that powered psychological processes. Complexes were not just cognitive patterns, but feeling-toned clusters of associations. Archetypes manifested not just as images, but as numinous experiences carrying powerful affect. The whole process of psychological transformation involved emotional engagement. Encountering the shadow provokes fear and shame. Meeting the anima or animus brings longing and fascination. Approaching the self evokes awe. This difference reflects their different subject matters. If you are studying how the eye organizes visual patterns, emotion is not obviously relevant. If you are studying psychological transformation through dreams and active imagination, emotion is essential. Yet there is an interesting connection. Both Jung and the Gestalt founders recognized that consciousness is drawn towards certain patterns. For Gestalt psychology, this was expressed as the tendency toward good, Gestalt, toward simple, regular, balanced organization. Consciousness seeks equilibrium, completeness, coherence. For Jung, consciousness is drawn toward the self, toward wholeness and integration. There is a kind of psychological tropism, a movement toward completeness that manifests in the recurring patterns of individuation. Both describe consciousness as having inherent tendencies, as not being merely passive or reactive, but as actively seeking certain states or forms. One describes this in terms of perceptual principles, the other in terms of archetypal development, but both see consciousness as purposive in some sense. This raises the question of whether they are describing the same phenomenon at different levels. Is the psyche's movement toward wholeness, Jung related to consciousness's tendency toward good Gestalt? Are both expressions of some more fundamental principle of organization inherent in complex systems? Such questions point toward potential, integration. But neither Jung nor the Gestalt founders pursued this systematically. They remained focused on their own domains, using their own languages, developing their own methods. Another area of contrast is their attitude toward culture and history. The Gestalt psychologists were largely ahistorical in their approach. The principles of perceptual organization were considered universal, inherent in the structure of consciousness itself, the same for humans across all cultures and times. This made experimental results generalizable. What Kohler discovered about insight in chimpanzees, or what Wertheimer found about apparent motion, could be assumed to apply universally. Jung, though he believed archetypes were universal, was intensely interested in how they manifest differently across cultures and historical periods. He studied Egyptian mythology, Gnostic texts, medieval alchemy, Chinese philosophy, African tribal religion, always seeking to understand how different cultures gave form to the same underlying archetypal patterns. For Jung, history mattered because consciousness develops not just individually, but collectively. Different epochs emphasize different archetypal patterns, develop consciousness in different directions. The medieval period, with its religious symbolism and alchemical imagery, gave form to archetypal content in ways modern rationalism has lost. Understanding history, particularly the history of symbolic and religious expression, was essential for understanding the psyche. The Gestalt founders, committed to a natural science of consciousness, were less interested in historical and cultural variation. They sought timeless principles, not historically specific manifestations. This gave their work a kind of clean precision, but also a certain abstractness. a disconnection from the rich particularity of human cultural experience. Jung's approach was opposite, deeply immersed in particular cultural and historical expressions of archetypal patterns, sometimes at the cost of experimental rigor or clear specification of principles. His work is rich with imagery and examples, but harder to systematize or test. We can see these as complementary strengths. Gestalt psychology provides precise principles of organization that are universal and testable. Jungian psychology provides rich understanding of how archetypal patterns manifest in particular cultural and individual expressions. One gives structure, the other gives content. Let us imagine a specific encounter. Jung is exploring a patient's dream of a square garden with a fountain at the center. He amplifies this through cultural parallels, the paradise garden of Islamic tradition, the hortus conclusus of medieval Christianity, the temenos of Greek sacred space. The square represents the quaternity, a mandala-like organization of psychic space. The fountain is the source, the self, the center from which life flows. A Gestalt psychologist, observing Jung's method, might appreciate the attention to pattern, the symmetry, the centrality, the balance, but they might question whether Jung is really attending to the patient's actual experience or is imposing his own knowledge of comparative religion. How does Jung know the dream means all these things? Is he describing what is given or interpreting based on theoretical preconceptions? Jung might respond that the parallel images across cultures point to an archetypal foundation. The fact that the square garden with central fountain appears in so many traditions suggests it expresses a universal pattern of the psyche. The patient's unconscious is drawing on this collective heritage, giving symbolic form to the movement toward wholeness happening in their individual process. The Gestalt psychologist might remain skeptical. Perhaps the patient simply saw a garden once and dreamed of it, and the rest is Jung's elaboration. Without more evidence, how can we know? Jung would say the proof is in the psychological effect. If the interpretation resonates with the patient, if it helps them integrate what was split, if it advances the individuation process, then it is valid. The criterion is not experimental replication, but therapeutic efficacy and psychological truth. Here we see the tension between two models of validation. Gestalt psychology seeks intersubjective verification through experimental replication. If the same results occur across different subjects under controlled conditions, the principle is validated. Jung seeks validation through psychological resonance and therapeutic effectiveness. If an interpretation helps the patient, if it rings true to their experience, if it facilitates development, it is valid. Both are legitimate forms of validation, but they suit different kinds of inquiry. You can replicate an experiment on apparent motion with different subjects and get consistent results. You cannot replicate an interpretation of a specific dream in the same way, because the dream's meaning depends on the dreamer's unique situation, associations, and developmental stage. This points to a fundamental difference in what kind of psychology each was developing. Gestalt psychology aimed to be a nomothetic science, seeking general laws that apply to all cases. Jung psychology was more idiographic, attending to the particularity of each individual case, while also seeking universal patterns in the form of archetypes. Yet Jung's archetypes have something in common with Gestalt principles. Both are patterns of organization that are universal and inherent in consciousness. The archetype of the mother organizes experience of nurturance and containment across all humans, much as the principle of figure-ground organization operates in all human perception. Both are structural principles not learned but given in the nature of consciousness itself. The difference is that Gestalt principles organize perception and cognition, while Jungian archetypes organize meaning and symbol. Gestalt principles are formal, archetypes are content-laden. Gestalt principles can be described mathematically, archetypes must be described imagistically and narratively. Perhaps they are describing different layers of the same phenomenon. Consciousness has inherent organizational principles at the perceptual level, Gestalt, and at the symbolic level, Jung. The first shapes how we see. The second shapes what we mean. If this is true, then a complete psychology would need both. It would need to understand the formal principles of perceptual and cognitive organization that Gestalt psychology discovered, and it would need to understand the archetypal patterns of symbolic meaning that Jung articulated. Neither alone is sufficient. Yet in their own time, these two approaches remained largely separate, pursued by different communities using different methods toward different goals. The Gestalt psychologists in Berlin, and later in America, continued their experimental studies of perception and problem-solving. Jung in Zurich continued his explorations of dreams, symbols, and the process of individuation. They were parallel streams, sometimes flowing through similar territories, but rarely mixing. As you rest now, breathing slowly, letting these ideas settle like snow falling on quiet hills, consider how both these approaches are present in your own experience. You organize what you perceive according to patterns, figure, and ground, grouping by similarity and proximity, seeking coherence and completion. This is the Gestalt dimension of your consciousness, always at work, structuring the chaos of sensory input into meaningful patterns. And you also organize experience through stories and symbols, through archetypal patterns of hero and shadow, journey and return, death and rebirth. This is the Jungian dimension, giving meaning and significance to the patterns you perceive. Both are operating now as you listen to these words, as you drift between waking and sleeping. Your perceptual system organizes the sounds into words, the words into sentences, the sentences into meanings. This is Gestalt organization. And the meanings evoke images and resonances, connect to your own psychological journey, touch archetypal patterns in your own unconscious. This is the Jungian dimension. Neither alone is complete. Together, they begin to describe the full complexity of consciousness, how it organizes both perception and meaning, both form and content, both structure and story. We have explored their differences. Now, let us consider what their shared opposition to reductionism reveals. Both Jung and the Gestalt founders were fighting against the dominant psychological paradigms of their time. Jung opposed Freud's reduction of all psychic life to infantile sexuality, opposed the materialism that saw consciousness as merely an epiphenomenon of brain processes. The Gestalt founders opposed one's structuralism that tried to break consciousness into elementary sensations, opposed behaviorism's elimination of consciousness from psychology altogether. Both insisted that psychology must attend to its phenomena as they actually present themselves. For the Gestalt founders, this meant acknowledging that perception gives us wholes, not just collections of sensations. For Jung, this meant acknowledging that the psyche spontaneously produces symbols, not just symptoms to be explained away. Both recognized that analysis into parts destroys what needs to be understood. You cannot understand a melody by analyzing individual notes, cannot understand an archetype by reducing it to simpler components. Wholeness is real, primary, fundamental. This shared holism made both approaches vulnerable to criticism from the dominant scientific psychology of the mid-20th century. Behaviorism, with its focus on observable behavior and measurable outcomes, had little room for either Gestalt wholes or Jungian archetypes. Cognitive psychology, when it emerged in the 1960s, was more sympathetic to Gestalt principles, but still focused on information processing and computational models that had trouble accommodating symbolic meaning in Jung's sense. Yet both approaches have proven remarkably enduring. Gestalt principles of perception are now standard in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. No serious researcher doubts that perception involves holistic organization according to principles of grouping and figure-ground segregation. The Gestalt founders were right. Wholes are real, and understanding perception requires understanding how the mind creates them. Jung's influence has been different, but also profound. While analytical psychology remains somewhat marginal in academic psychology, Jung's ideas have permeated cultural psychology, religious studies, literary criticism, and popular consciousness. The concepts of archetype, individuation, and the collective unconscious have become part of how educated people understand human experience, even if they don't fully endorse Jung's theoretical framework. Perhaps both have endured because both attended to real features of consciousness that other approaches neglected. Consciousness does organize experience according to principles of good Gestalt. This is an empirical fact that Gestalt psychology demonstrated. And consciousness does engage with symbolic meanings that seem to transcend individual experience. This is a phenomenological reality that Jung articulated, even if its scientific status remains contested. A psychology that includes both would be richer than either alone. It would understand how consciousness organizes both perception and meaning, how formal patterns and archetypal content both shape experience, how cognitive structure and symbolic significance both matter for understanding human nature. Let us consider one more area of comparison: their understanding of the relationship between individual and collective. For the Gestalt psychologists, the principles of perceptual organization are universal, inherent in how consciousness works. In this sense, they are collective. Every human perceives, figure and ground, organizes by similarity and proximity, seeks good Gestalt, but these are formal principles, not shared contents. Each individual's perceptions are their own, organized according to universal principles, but not containing shared images or meanings. Jung's collective unconscious is different. It contains not just formal principles, but shared archetypal images. The mother is not just an organizing principle, but a pattern that manifests in specific symbolic forms as the actual mother, as the ocean, as the vessel, as the earth. These forms appear across cultures because they express universal aspects of human experience, mediated through the archetypes. This is a much stronger claim about what is shared among humans. The Gestalt founders would likely have been skeptical. How can images be inherited? How can the unconscious contain specific symbolic contents rather than just general organizing principles? Jung struggled with this question himself. He was clear that archetypes themselves are not images, but patterns that give rise to images. The archetype of the mother is a formal principle, a readiness to recognize and respond to maternal care. The specific images through which it appears: the personal mother, the goddess Demeter, the Virgin Mary, are cultural and individual elaborations of the underlying pattern. This is closer to the Gestalt position than it might first appear. Both are saying that consciousness contains inherent organizing patterns. Gestalt says these patterns organize perception. Jung says these patterns organize symbolic meaning. Both say the patterns are universal and formal, while specific manifestations vary, yet differences remain. Gestalt principles are entirely formal and contentless figure ground. Organization works the same way whether you're looking at a face, or a vase, or a landscape. Jungian archetypes, even if formally defined, have specific domains of content. The mother is about nurturance and containment, not about heroic adventure. The hero is about confronting challenges, not about maternal care. This suggests archetypes are not purely formal but carry inherent orientations towards certain kinds of content. This makes them richer but also more difficult to define precisely and test empirically. In the end, perhaps we return to the central insight each offers. The Gestalt founders showed us that consciousness is inherently holistic, that it organizes experience according to principles that create coherent patterns from fragmentary inputs, that insight involves seeing structural relationships rather than just accumulating associations. This is a profound and verifiable truth about how mind works. Jung showed us that consciousness exists in relation to depths it does, not control. That the psyche spontaneously produces symbols expressing universal patterns of human experience, that psychological development involves integrating conscious and unconscious toward a wholeness that transcends yet includes the ego. This is a profound and experientially resonant truth about human psychological life. Both truths are needed. A psychology that understood only perceptual organization but not symbolic meaning would miss much of what makes human experience human. A psychology that attended only to symbolic meaning but not to the principles of cognitive organization would lack scientific rigor and explanatory power. The dialogue between them, though largely unspoken during their lifetimes, continues to illuminate the mystery of consciousness. They were two approaches to wholeness, one through the structure of perception, the other through the content of symbol. Together, they begin to encompass the full dimensionality of human consciousness, both how we organize experience and what that experience means. Now, in the third movement of our exploration, let us drift into more lyrical reflection on what their dialogue reveals about the nature of mind and meaning, about the territory their combined insights illuminate. Let your breathing deepen. Feel your body becoming heavier, more relaxed. The story continues, but now it moves from comparison toward meditation, from analysis toward contemplation. What is consciousness? This is the question both Jung and the Gestalt founders were asking, though in such different ways. For the Gestalt founders, consciousness is a field of organization, a space where patterns emerge from chaos, where the mind brings order to experience. They saw it as active, not passive, not a mirror reflecting reality, but a force that structures reality into meaningful forms. The world does not come to us pre-organized. We organize it, though not arbitrarily. The organization follows principles inherent in how consciousness works, principles of grouping and figuring and structuring. This is consciousness as maker of patterns, as a creative power that transforms raw sensory input into the meaningful world we inhabit. Without this organizing activity, there would be only chaos, only disconnected sensations. The miracle is that consciousness creates wholes, finds patterns, makes sense. This is what perception does, moment by moment, effortlessly. You are doing it now, creating a meaningful experience from the pressure of pillow against cheek, the weight of blankets, the sound of these words, the thoughts and images they evoke. All of this is being organized into a coherent present, a unified field of experience. This is the Gestalt miracle. For Jung, consciousness is something else, or something more. It is the surface of depths, the visible part of an invisible wholeness. The ego, that center of conscious identity, is like a candle flame in a vast darkness. By its light, we see a small circle of the world and call this reality. But beyond the circle lie depths upon depths, the personal unconscious, with its forgotten memories and repressed desires, and beneath that, the collective unconscious, with its archetypal patterns and universal symbols. Consciousness, in this vision, is always incomplete, always in relation to what it does not know. The ego is surrounded by the psyche, which is so much larger than consciousness, containing all we might become, all we have been, all humanity has experienced across the millennia of our existence. To be conscious is to be partially unconscious, to live with the paradox that most of who we are lies beyond our awareness. But the unconscious is not merely absence, it is presence, power, purpose. It produces dreams that guide and compensate the conscious attitude. It sends up symbols that express what consciousness cannot yet formulate. It drives the process of individuation, that movement toward wholeness that is the deepest purpose of psychological life. These are different pictures of consciousness, but are they incompatible? Perhaps not. Perhaps consciousness is both what the Gestalt founders saw and what Jung saw, both the organizer of present experience and the surface of greater depths. Perhaps the principles of perceptual organization operate in the foreground while archetypal patterns move in the background. Perhaps immediate experience is structured by Gestalt laws while deeper meanings are shaped by archetypal forms. Consider a dream. As an experience, it has perceptual organization. Images appear as figure against ground. Elements group according to similarity and proximity. The dream space has structure that follows Gestalt principles. But the dream also has symbolic meaning. It compensates the conscious attitude, expresses unconscious content, points toward integration through archetypal imagery. Both levels are real. Both need to be understood. The Gestalt founders attended to the first level, Jung to the second. But the levels are not separate. They are dimensions of the same phenomenon, aspects of the single wholeness that is conscious experience. Or consider the experience of insight. As the Gestalt founders showed, insight involves perceptual restructuring, seeing the problem in a new way, grasping relationships that were not apparent before. This is a cognitive event with a clear phenomenology. Suddenly, the solution is obvious, necessary, right. But insight can also be deeper, more existential. It can be the moment when you suddenly see the pattern in your life, recognize the complex that has been driving you, understand what your dreams have been trying to tell you. This is Jungian insight, symbolic rather than cognitive, though it may have the same aha quality. Are these the same? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Both involve a sudden shift in how experience is organized. Both bring the satisfaction of coherence, of seeing how it fits. But cognitive insight reorganizes thoughts, while psychological insight reorganizes the self. One is about solving a problem. The other is about transforming identity. Yet perhaps they are related. Perhaps all insight involves some reorganization of consciousness, some shift in how experience is structured. And perhaps all such reorganization partakes of both dimensions, the cognitive and the existential, the structural and the meaningful. This points toward a deeper unity. Consciousness is fundamentally about organization and meaning simultaneously. We cannot separate form from content, structure from significance, how from what. The Gestalt founders showed us the how. Jung showed us the what. But in actual experience, they are inseparable. Think of a story. It has structure, beginning, middle, end, characters, plot, setting. This structure can be analyzed in formal terms, as narrative theorists do. But a story also has meaning. It speaks to something in us, evokes emotions, illuminates aspects of human experience, sometimes touches archetypal patterns. The structure carries the meaning takes the form of structure. You cannot have one without the other. So too with consciousness. It has structure, the Gestalt principles of organization, the forms through which experience is shaped. And it has meaning, the symbolic dimensions Jung explored, the archetypal patterns that give experience significance. The structure enables the meaning. The meaning manifests through structure. Perhaps what both Jung and the Gestalt founders were discovering, in their different ways, was that consciousness is pattern. Not just any pattern, but meaningful pattern. Pattern that carries significance, that organizes experience into wholes that matter. The Gestalt founders focused on the formal aspects of pattern, how elements organize into wholes, what principles govern perceptual and cognitive organization. Jung focused on the meaningful aspects of pattern, what the patterns mean, how they relate to the human journey toward wholeness, why certain patterns appear across cultures and times. Both were studying the same thing from different angles. Consciousness as patterning activity, mind as weaver of wholeness, the psyche as something that cannot endure chaos, that must organize, structure, make sense, but not randomly. The organization follows principles, both formal principles and meaningful ones, both Gestalt laws and archetypal patterns. In the deepest sense, perhaps there is no conflict between them. They were complementary explorers of the same territory, one mapping the geography, the other interpreting the meaning of the landmarks. One was asking, how does consciousness organize? The other, what does consciousness mean? Both questions are essential. Consider the human need for meaning. We cannot live in pure chaos. We cannot endure pure randomness. We must find pattern, order, sense. This is not optional. It is built into how consciousness works. The Gestalt founders showed this at the perceptual level. We automatically organize sensory input, cannot help but see figure and ground, create wholes from parts. Jung showed it at the existential level. We automatically seek meaning in our experiences, cannot help but create narratives, find symbols, interpret events as significant. Both are describing the same fundamental feature of consciousness. It is inherently sense-making. It organizes chaos into cosmos, transforms the meaningless into the meaningful, creates order from disorder. This is what consciousness does. Whether organizing visual patterns or life stories, whether seeing faces in clouds or gods in the heavens, whether solving mathematical problems or navigating psychological crises, it patterns, it organizes, it makes wholes, it creates meaning. And perhaps this reveals something essential about being human. We are the creatures who cannot bear pure chaos, who must organize, experience, who create meaning not as an optional activity, but as the fundamental act of consciousness itself. The Gestalt founders showed us the principles of this organizing activity in perception and cognition. Jung showed us the patterns this activity creates in the realm of symbol and psyche. Together, they illuminate how consciousness works as an organizing principle that creates meaningful wholes, whether those wholes are perceptual gestalts or archetypal patterns. What does this mean for how we understand ourselves? It suggests that we are not simply receivers of experience, but creators of it. We actively structure what we perceive, not arbitrarily, but according to inherent principles. We actively create the meanings through which we understand our lives, not randomly, but according to archetypal patterns that reflect universal human experiences. This is a vision of human consciousness as profoundly creative. We are not merely shaped by external forces, but shape our experience through the organizing activity of consciousness itself. Yet this shaping is not unconstrained. It follows principles, Gestalt principles at the perceptual level, archetypal principles at the symbolic level. We are free, but not absolutely free. We create meaning, but not arbitrarily. We are constrained by the inherent structures of consciousness itself, by the principles that govern how organization happens, by the archetypal patterns that shape symbolic expression. This is a beautiful paradox. Consciousness is both constrained and creative, both structured and free. It follows laws, yet produces novelty. It inherits patterns, yet creates new meanings. Both Jung and the Gestalt founders recognized this. The Gestalt founders showed that perception, while creative, follows principles. We see what is not there, the phi phenomenon of apparent motion, the triangle and three Pac-Man shapes arranged just so, but we cannot see just anything. Our creativity is constrained by Gestalt laws. Jung showed that symbolic expression, while infinitely various, follows archetypal patterns. Dreams and myths create endless variations, but the basic patterns, the hero's journey, the wise old man, the sacred marriage recur across cultures because they express fundamental structures of human experience. So consciousness is neither purely deterministic nor purely free. It is structured creativity, patterned spontaneity, lawful innovation. It inherits forms but fills them with new content. It follows principles but applies them to ever-new situations. This is what makes human experience both universal and particular. We all organize perception according to Gestalt principles. In this, we are universal. But what we perceive varies infinitely. In this, we are particular. We all experience archetypal patterns. In this, we are universal. But how they manifest in our individual lives varies infinitely. In this, we are particular. The dialogue between Jung and the Gestalt founders illuminates this mystery of sameness and difference, of universal principles and particular expressions, of structure and variation. Perhaps this is why both approaches remain relevant. They describe something essential about consciousness that transcends the historical moment of their discovery. Gestalt principles of perception remain true whether we are looking at a painting on a cave wall or an image on a screen. Archetypal patterns remain relevant whether we are reading an ancient myth or a contemporary novel. The principles and patterns they discovered are not contingent truths that might be otherwise, but necessary features of how consciousness works. This gives both approaches a kind of timeless quality, an enduring relevance that survives changes in psychological fashion. Yet both also have limitations. The Gestalt approach, in its focus on formal principles, can miss the richness of meaning. It can explain how we organize perception, but not what experience means to us. It can describe the structure of insight, but not the content of wisdom. Jung's approach, in its focus on symbolic meaning, can become untethered from empirical constraint. It can find meanings everywhere, see archetypes in every dream, interpret all experience as symbolic. Without the grounding of experimental method and precise description, it risks becoming unfalsifiable, seeing whatever it wants to see. Each needs what the other offers. Gestalt psychology needs something like Jung's attention to meaning and symbol to fully account for human experience. Jung's psychology needs something like Gestalt's empirical rigor and precise principles to ground its interpretations. An integrated psychology, one that combined Gestalt's attention to perceptual and cognitive organization with Jung's exploration of symbolic meaning and archetypal patterns, would be more complete than either alone. It would understand both how consciousness structures experience and what that experience means. It would appreciate both formal patterns and meaningful content. It would be both scientifically rigorous and existentially rich. Such an integration has not fully happened, though there are hints of it in various places. Phenomenological psychology attempts to describe experience in its fullness, attending both to structure and meaning. Cognitive approaches to emotion and motivation try to understand how formal processes serve meaningful purposes. Narrative psychology explores how people organize their life stories, attending both to narrative structure and personal meaning. Perhaps the full integration still awaits us. Perhaps future psychology will find ways to honor both the Gestalt insight into formal organization and the Jungian insight into symbolic depth. Perhaps we are still learning to speak a language that can encompass both dimensions of consciousness. But even without complete integration, both perspectives enrich our understanding. They remind us that consciousness is multidimensional, that it operates at multiple levels simultaneously, that understanding human experience requires attending to both structure and meaning, both form and content, both how and what. As your breath slows further, as sleep draws nearer, let these reflections settle into your awareness like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward but ultimately coming to rest in depth. What would Jung and Wertheimer say to each other if they could meet in that timeless space where ideas converse? Perhaps Jung would say, "You have shown us how the mind creates wholes, how perception is active rather than passive, how insight involves seeing structural relationships. This is profound. But do you not wonder about the contents of consciousness, about why certain patterns compel us, about what our symbols mean?" And perhaps Wertheimer would respond, "You have shown us that human experience is rich with meaning, that symbols carry significance, that the psyche has depths beyond the ego. This is valuable. But do you not risk imposing meanings that are not there, reading your own knowledge into others' experiences, seeing archetypes where there are only individual associations?" Jung might reply, "The meanings I find are not imposed but discovered. They are inherent in the symbols themselves, which express archetypal patterns. The proof is in the psychological effect, in whether the interpretation helps the person integrate what is split, become more whole," Wertheimer might say. But this is not verification in any scientific sense. You cannot replicate your interpretations, cannot test them against objective standards. Your method is more art than science. And Jung might respond, "Perhaps so. But the psyche itself is more art than science. It speaks in symbols, not propositions. It expresses meaning through image and metaphor. To understand it, we need a method suited to its nature, one that can interpret rather than merely measure." Both would be right. Jung's hermeneutic approach is necessary for understanding symbolic meaning. Wertheimer's empirical approach is necessary for establishing reliable principles. Neither alone is sufficient. Their imagined dialogue reveals the productive tension between interpretation and observation, between seeking meaning and establishing facts, between understanding and explaining. Both are essential activities of psychology. Both are necessary for a full account of consciousness. Perhaps we can see their relationship as complementary rather than contradictory. The Gestalt founders established the principles of how consciousness organizes experience. Jung explored what kinds of meanings consciousness creates. One gives us the formal structure, the other the meaningful content. Together, they begin to encompass the full richness of psychological life. Consider one more time the question of wholeness, which both so valued. For the Gestalt founders, wholeness meant good Gestalt, simple, regular, balanced, complete. A circle is more whole than a jagged line. A symmetrical pattern is more whole than an asymmetrical one. A solution that grasps the inner structure of a problem is more whole than one that mechanically applies rules. This is wholeness as coherence, as integration of parts into a unified whole where each part relates meaningfully to every other. It is a formal concept of wholeness, describable in terms of structural properties. For Jung, wholeness meant something different and more. It meant the integration of conscious and unconscious, the union of opposites, the realization of the self. It was not just formal coherence, but psychological completeness, the achievement of being fully who you are, individuated, whole. This is wholeness as fulfillment, as the completion of a developmental journey, as the achievement of a meaningful life. It is an existential concept of wholeness, describable only through narrative and symbol. Are these different wholes? Perhaps. But perhaps they are related. Perhaps psychological wholeness in Jung's sense requires perceptual and cognitive wholeness in Gestalt's sense. Perhaps you cannot become individuated if your perception is fragmented, your thinking is blind, your understanding is rote rather than insightful, and perhaps perceptual and cognitive wholeness points toward or prepares for psychological wholeness. Perhaps the mind's inherent tendency toward good Gestalt in perception is related to the psyche's movement toward integration and individuation. Perhaps the same principle is operating at different levels, a principle of wholeness, of completion, of integration that manifests both in how we organize perception and in how we develop psychologically. This is speculation, but it suggests a deep connection between their insights. Perhaps consciousness at every level seeks wholeness in perception, Gestalt, in cognition, productive thinking, in psychological development, individuation, in the relationship between conscious and unconscious, the self. If this is true, then Jung and the Gestalt founders were describing different manifestations of the same fundamental tendency of consciousness toward wholeness and integration. They were studying the same phenomenon at different levels, using different methods, speaking different languages, but ultimately illuminating the same deep truth about human nature. We are creatures who seek wholeness. We cannot rest in fragmentation. We must organize, integrate, complete. This is what perception does, what thinking does, what the psyche does in its lifelong journey of individuation. All are expressions of the same underlying drive toward unity and coherence. This is a profound insight, one that emerges only from considering Jung and the Gestalt founders together, from allowing their different perspectives to illuminate each other. Neither alone reveals this fully, but together they begin to show us something essential about what it means to be conscious, to be human, to be alive. The The drive toward wholeness is not something we choose. It is built into consciousness itself. We organize because we must. We seek meaning because we cannot help it. We move toward integration because that is the nature of the psyche. Both Jung and the Gestalt founders, in their different ways, were describing this fundamental feature of consciousness. Both were showing us that we are not passive recipients of experience, but active creators of coherence and meaning. Both were revealing the deep creativity of consciousness, its inherent drive to organize chaos into cosmos, to transform fragmentation into wholeness. This is perhaps their greatest shared gift, helping us see that consciousness is fundamentally a creative process, that we are not merely shaped by external forces, but are shapers of our own experience, that we participate actively in creating the meaningful world we inhabit. Yet this creativity is not arbitrary. It follows principles, Gestalt principles at the perceptual level, archetypal patterns at the symbolic level. We are constrained by our nature as conscious beings, by the structures inherent in consciousness itself. This combination of creativity and constraint, freedom and structure, variation and pattern is what makes human experience both universal and unique, both predictable and surprising, both lawful and spontaneous. Understanding this requires both approaches: the Gestalt attention to formal principles and the Jungian attention to meaningful patterns. Neither alone is sufficient. Together, they begin to encompass the full dimensionality of consciousness. As the night deepens and sleep draws you into its embrace, let these thoughts dissolve like mist in morning sun. The dialogue between Jung and the Gestalt founders continues in ways beyond words, in the deep places where consciousness organizes itself, where patterns emerge from chaos, where meaning arises from experience. You participate in this dialogue every moment. Your perception organizes according to Gestalt principles even now. Your psyche moves through archetypal patterns even as you sleep. The wholeness both discovered is your wholeness. The organization they studied is your organizing activity. The creativity they revealed is your creativity. In understanding them, we understand something essential about ourselves. We see that we are makers of meaning and pattern, creators of wholeness from fragmentation, weavers of coherence from chaos. This is our nature as conscious beings. This is the miracle of awareness itself. The Gestalt founders showed us the structure of this miracle. Jung showed us its significance. Together, they illuminate the mystery of consciousness, how it works and what it means, how it organizes and why it matters. Their dialogue, whether they knew it or not, is the dialogue between structure and meaning, between form and content, between science and art, between observation and interpretation. It is a dialogue that continues in psychology, in philosophy, in every attempt to understand human experience in its fullness. We need both voices in this dialogue. We need the precision and rigor of the Gestalt approach and the depth and richness of the Jungian approach. We need to know how consciousness works and what it means. We need both map and story, both principle and symbol, both explanation and understanding. This is what their comparison reveals. Not that one is right and the other wrong, but that both are necessary. That consciousness is too complex and too rich to be captured by any single approach. That understanding human experience requires multiple perspectives, multiple methods, multiple languages. The Gestalt founders give us one language, the language of perceptual organization, of insight, of productive thinking. Jung gives us another, the language of archetype, symbol, individuation. Both languages are needed to speak about the full range of human psychological life. In the end, what their dialogue teaches us is humility. No single perspective can encompass the whole truth about consciousness. We need multiple approaches, multiple methods, multiple ways of seeing. The richness of human experience exceeds any single framework's capacity to capture it. Yet, their dialogue also gives us confidence. While no single approach is complete, together different approaches can begin to encompass consciousness in its fullness. By combining the Gestalt insights into perceptual organization with Jungian insights into symbolic meaning, by honoring both structure and significance, both form and content, we move toward a more complete understanding of human psychological life. This is the gift of comparison, of dialogue, of allowing different perspectives to illuminate each other. Neither Jung nor the Gestalt founders alone tells the whole story, but together, in conversation across their differences, they reveal more than either could alone. So let us honor both. Let us appreciate the Gestalt founders' careful attention to how consciousness organizes perception and thought. Let us value Jung's profound exploration of symbolic meaning and psychological depth. Let us recognize that both are necessary, that both illuminate essential aspects of human experience, that both contribute to our understanding of what it means to be conscious. And let us carry forward their shared commitment to wholeness, their shared opposition to reductionism, their shared insistence that psychology must attend to its phenomena in their full richness rather than reducing them to simpler elements. This is their common legacy, a psychology that honors wholeness, that seeks to understand rather than merely explain, that recognizes consciousness as creative, purposive, meaningful. Whether we understand this wholeness in perceptual terms or symbolic terms, whether we study organization or meaning, we are participating in the project they began, the project of understanding human consciousness in all its depth and complexity. As you drift now towards sleep, carry with you this vision of consciousness as patterned creativity, as structured meaning-making, as the weaving of wholeness from fragments. This is what you are doing every moment, organizing experience, creating meaning, seeking integration. The Gestalt founders and Jung were describing your consciousness, the very consciousness that is now releasing its hold on waking thought, letting images and associations flow more freely, beginning the transition into dream. In dream, perhaps, the two approaches finally unite. Dreams have structure. They organize images according to principles of association and emotion. They create coherent scenes from the day's residue. This is the Gestalt dimension. But dreams also carry, meaning they compensate the conscious attitude, express unconscious content, speak in symbols that point toward integration. This is the Jungian dimension. The dream itself does not separate these. It is simultaneously structured and meaningful, organized and symbolic. Perhaps this is consciousness's true nature, revealed most clearly when the ego's control relaxes and the psyche speaks more freely. Perhaps in sleep we see what Jung and the Gestalt founders were both pointing toward consciousness as inherently whole, simultaneously formal and meaningful, structured and significant, organized and symbolic. As this realization settles into the deepest places of awareness, let go of all effort to understand, all attempt to grasp. Let the ideas and images flow through consciousness like water through an open hand. Jung and Wertheimer, Kohler and Kafka, analytical psychology and Gestalt psychology all are dissolving now into the greater wholeness of consciousness itself, that consciousness which is both yours and not. Yours, both individual and universal, both structured by principles and laden with meaning. Rest in this wholeness, sleep in this integration. Let consciousness organize itself according to its own nature, creating patterns you need not understand, weaving meanings you need not interpret. The dialogue between Jung and the Gestalt founders continues in depths beyond words. In the silent places where consciousness knows itself, where structure and meaning are one, where the formal and the symbolic unite in the simple fact of awareness itself. May this dialogue continue in your own consciousness, enriching your perception and deepening your self-understanding, bringing both clarity and meaning to your experience of being alive. Sleep now. Dream. Let the patterns emerge. Let the symbols speak. Let consciousness do what it does best. Organize chaos into cosmos. Weave fragments into wholes. Create meaning from experience. The Gestalt founders and Jung have given you maps of this territory, different maps of the same landscape. As you wander through your inner world in sleep, their maps will guide you, help you recognize the patterns in perception and the patterns in dream, the structures that organize and the symbols that signify. But ultimately, the territory is yours to explore. The consciousness they studied is your consciousness. The wholeness they sought is your wholeness. The integration they described is your life's work. Carry their insights lightly as you cross into sleep. They are not burdens to bear, but gifts to receive, not rigid frameworks, but flexible tools, not final answers, but helpful perspectives. In the morning, when consciousness returns to its waking mode, something of tonight's journey will remain a deeper appreciation for how mind makes meaning, how perception organizes experience, how the psyche seeks wholeness. But for now, let all this go. Release the ideas. Allow the words to fade. Surrender to the deeper patterns of consciousness as it moves from waking into dreaming, from thought into image, from analysis into synthesis. The dialogue between Jung and the Gestalt founders becomes the dialogue between sleeping and waking, between conscious and unconscious, between structure and meaning that is your own psychological life. Rest in this dialogue. Sleep in this wholeness. Dream in this integration. The conversation continues in silence, in darkness, in the deep places where consciousness knows itself beyond words, beyond concepts, beyond all our attempts to understand. And in that knowing, in that silent recognition, the differences between approaches dissolve, the boundaries between thinkers fade, and there remains only consciousness itself whole, integrated, complete organizing and meaning-making, structured and symbolic, both Gestalt and Jungian, both principle and pattern, both form and content. This is the final truth their dialogue reveals, that consciousness is one, even as we describe it in many ways, that the psyche is whole, even as we analyze it into aspects, that human experience is unified, even as we need multiple perspectives to understand it. May you rest in this wholeness tonight and every night. May you wake with clearer perception and deeper meaning. May the patterns Jung and the Gestalt founders discovered enrich your understanding of your own consciousness, your own journey, your own life. Sleep now, dear listener. The story is complete but never finished. The dialogue continues but is also always at rest. The exploration goes on, but has also arrived. In the paradox of consciousness itself, simultaneously active and receptive, organizing and receiving, creating and discovering, you find the synthesis of all we have explored tonight. Jung's depth and Gestalt's precision, archetypal meaning and perceptual structure, symbolic interpretation, and phenomenological description. All of it is true. All of it is yours. All of it is consciousness, knowing itself through many voices, many methods, many ways of seeing. Rest now in that multiplicity that is also unity, that difference that is also wholeness, that dialogue that is also silence. Good night, wanderer. May your dreams be organized by Gestalt principles and laden with Jungian meaning. May your consciousness find the wholeness both thinkers sought. May you wake renewed, integrated, complete. The conversation between great minds continues in you, through you, as you. This is the final gift of comparison, not knowledge about psychology, but transformation of consciousness itself. Not information, but insight. Not theory, but lived experience of what it means to be whole. Sleep gently. Dream deeply. Wake wise. The story is told. The night is yours. The patterns await in the darkness, ready to organize your dreams into meaningful wholes, to weave your experience into integrated patterns, to guide your psyche's eternal movement toward wholeness. Rest now. All is well. All is whole. All is one.